Good morning. Good morning and welcome to this Conservation Applied Research and Development or CARD webinar on demystifying standalone dehumidifiers. Thanks so much for joining us today. We hope you and your families are continuing safe and healthy, and we also want to thank you in advance for your patience with any technical difficulties we might have related to the fact that all of our presenters are connected remotely. I'm Mary Sue Lobenstein, the R&D Program Administrator at the Minnesota Department of Commerce, Division of Energy Resources. With me today is Laura Silver, who is a Senior State Program Administrator at the Division of Energy Resources at the Department of Commerce, where she reviews utility conservation improvement program triennial plans and also annual status reports. Laura is the project manager of the research that is the subject of the webinar today and will be moderating the Q&A portion of our webinar. Our presenter today is Josh Quinnell, a senior research engineer at the Center for Energy and Environment. Josh has 13 years research experience in solar energy, heat and mass transfer, and energy efficiency, and was the primary investigator on the research that is being presented today. Josh is currently working on grid modernization efforts, including strategic electrification, solar energy deployment optimization, and using efficiency and other distributed energy resources to manage distribution system capacity. Josh's recent work includes HVAC duct leakage and retrofit sealing, condensing boiler efficiency, energy recovery ventilation systems, garage contaminant transport, and residential furnace efficiency retrofits. We're very pleased and lucky to have Josh today with us on the webinar. Before we start, I'll go over a few webinar basics, which will be familiar to many of you now that you've been attending a lot of meetings remotely, but all attendees will be in listen-only mode. We'll be answering all questions at the end of the presentation, but as questions occur to you during the webinar, please take the time to type them into the Q&A box on the bottom right side of the WebEx panel and send them to all panelists. We'll do our best to answer all questions within the time allocated, but if for some reason we don't get to all of the questions, we will answer them after the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the department's website at a later date. The webinar slide set will also be available at a later date on our website. This webinar is one in an ongoing series designed to summarize results from research projects funded by Minnesota's Applied Research and Development Fund, which was established in the Next Generation Energy Act of 2007. The purpose of that fund is to help Minnesota utilities achieve their energy savings goal. About $2.6 million of this fund is set aside annually for the CARD program, which awards research grants in a competitive request for proposal process. Results from CARD projects provide utilities with data to enhance energy efficiency program designs within their SIP portfolios. As you can see by this pie chart, CARD projects funded to date have been in all building sectors, as well as some that cross all or multiple sectors. The subject of today's webinar discusses the residential sector, and it discusses results from a study which looked at standalone dehumidifiers in single-family Minnesota homes. Now I'll turn it over to Josh, who will get us started on today's presentation.
Thanks, Mary Sue. So today's talk is called Demystifying Standalone Dehumidifiers. So the question we pose is, what do we really know about dehumidifiers? We know they're common, although estimates do vary widely. What do we know about these machines? Turns out there's not been a lot of recent work on dehumidifiers. There was good field work, but it's now about 10 years out of date. We can thank CADMIS and Energy Center for Wisconsin and NREL to some extent for a lot of quality field work from about 10 years ago. But what we haven't answered in this previous work is how well do these units work for homeowners, and where do they sort of fit in the picture, the energy picture of Minnesota single-family homes? This study was basically designed to answer these questions and give some up-to-date data on their performance. Before I get into our talk, I want to introduce my company. I'm from Center for Energy and Environment. We're a Minnesota nonprofit dedicated to advancing energy efficiency in the state of Minnesota. We do this by affecting policy on a state level. We do planning and consulting work with both communities and commercial buildings. We run financing programs to help consumers and businesses finance energy efficiency improvements and renewable energy systems. And we run programs for utilities to help Minnesota achieve its energy savings goals. I come from the research department, where we investigate technologies that will ultimately, we hope, impact these energy savings goals. So here's today's agenda. I'm going to begin by reviewing some background on humidity and portable dehumidification systems, just to kind of make sure we're all starting from the same point here. Then I'm going to break it out into discuss our survey work. We surveyed and visited single-family homes with dehumidifiers all over the state to learn about real dehumidification applications. Then I'll discuss our field work. We instrumented 20 homes in dehumidifiers to gather energy data, moisture removal data, figure out operational strategies that are actually employed in the field. And then we intervened at each of these sites to try to improve the dehumidification outcomes. And I'll wrap up today with some takeaways and recommendations from this work. Getting started, let's talk about the language of humidity. So humidity is discussed in many ways. They can often be confusing, and they depend on sort of your experience, your training. And I want to, again, like I said, I want to make sure we're all on the same page here and at least give you the upfront what I think is the right way to think about this, even if I misspeak when I talk about the various forms of humidity throughout the rest of this talk. So the most important concept is called the absolute humidity. This doesn't come up very frequently in sort of common discussions, but it is the most important principle. This really is how much moisture is in the air. I find it makes sense to think about it on a percentage basis. There is a limit to how much air, how much moisture the air can hold. That's about 1% at room temperature, but it's important to know that it's less at lower temperatures. And when the air is full of moisture, we call it saturated, and it can't hold any more vapor, water vapor. So that's when liquid water starts to condense out of the air. But the most familiar concept to most folks is called relative humidity. This is somewhat different than absolute humidity. It is what's reported by our devices and our forecasts. It's basically the amount of water in the air relative to the maximum amount of water that the air can hold. So it's the relative humidity. It's also, unfortunately, communicated in a percentage. But it's important to us because it's directly related to our comfort, and we can tie it to all sorts of things we care about, like microbial growth, like the health of building materials and whatnot. At high relative humidity, it's simply harder for our bodies to cool themselves. We cool predominantly through perspiration, and when the air has a lot of water in it, we cannot do that efficiently, and so we feel uncomfortable, we feel stuffy. At low relative humidity, our body cools rapidly. It's easy to perspire, and we often sense that as draftiness. Typically, it's about 50% relative humidity where most people report sort of optimum comfort. The study of air-water mixtures is called psychrometrics. Mechanical engineers spend a lot of time in school looking at weird and complex charts to try to understand these air-to-water mixtures because they're pretty important for HVAC design. But I want to kind of throw all that away and just draw your attention to two principles using this chart. This chart shows absolute humidity. Again, you can think about it as a percentage. It goes between something that's very close to 0 and maybe 1%. You can see for lines of fixed relative humidity, I show 3 there, absolute humidity changes as a function of temperature. It's a complicated way of saying that warm air holds more moisture than cold air. So the most important idea here is that warm air holds more moisture than cold air. But secondly, relative humidity does become important at particularly room temperatures where we're concerned about human comfort. So if we look at, say, a fixed temperature range of maybe 65 to 75 degrees, in this temperature range, people can sense that 80% relative humidity is uncomfortably humid. We can also sense that 20% humidity feels very dry and drafty. Again, 50% is optimum peak comfort. You can see in this range, the range of water vapor in the air maybe varies by about 30 or 40% in absolute units. So pretty significant, but again, it's much smaller than the net effect of temperature, which really determines how much water is in the air on an absolute basis. And incidentally, you can see here that at very cold temperatures, relative humidity effectively doesn't matter because there's such little amount of water vapor in the air. So in the coldest Minnesota weather, there's 100 times less water vapor than at room temperature. So there's this relationship between temperature, humidity, and comfort, and we use dehumidifiers, usually in the summertime, to change those conditions. So let's talk about that in a little bit more detail by discussing sort of the seasonal humidity variations in Minnesota. We are an extreme continental climate, and we have extreme variations in weather. Here again, I'm showing absolute humidity, again from about 0 to this time it goes up to about 2.5%, but this is of actual outdoor conditions measured in our study for 3 weather stations throughout Minnesota over 2 years. the first thing you can see is, so I have these 3 weather stations. They're green, blue, and yellow dots. On any hour, they do fluctuate quite a bit depending on where you are in the state. But the more important trend is the seasonal variation in humidity. And it's basically the same no matter where you are in Minnesota, because on an overall level, we have very similar weather. Again, these are extreme fluctuations in humidity. To put that in perspective, I have our indoor comfort levels shown in red. The thick red line is sort of optimum indoor comfort, 72 degrees and 50% humidity. The dashed red lines sort of show the extremes of comfort. Beyond this, most people are actively complaining about being uncomfortable. So you can see that the outside conditions mostly fall outside of the desirable indoor conditions. What that means is we end up having these forcing functions that dry our buildings or wet our buildings depending on the time of year. And in fact, Minnesota climate vacillates between the coldest weather and relatively hot weather. And what comes along with this is the driest weather. For example, we get humidity levels in the winter that rival the driest levels we see in Antarctica. In the summer, we have high humidity levels that rival what we see in equatorial rainforest, and Minnesota reliably bounces between these extremes every year. But it's really removing this excess summertime humidity that leads to our desire to own and operate mechanical dehumidification systems. So let's talk a little bit more about indoor humidity levels. I have an example house here. This is what we might call a median home in terms of age and size, say built in the early 70s, about 2,000 square feet. There's somewhere around 2 to 4 people living in here, maybe 2.3 or 2.8. Absent weatherization work, it probably has an ACH 50 of 8. That means when pressurized at 50 pascals, the air will turn over inside at about 8 times per hour. That's kind of leaky by today's standards, but it's very typical of older buildings. So we can classify where moisture comes from into 2 broad categories. Sources that are based on the occupants on the left in yellow, and then natural moisture sources on the right in blue. Directing your attention to the yellow plot, I show moisture generation in terms of pints per day. That's kind of the unit we'll use in terms of moisture capacity. The biggest source of moisture you'll see at 10 pints a day is from the family of 4. By simply living in this house, you respire, you breathe out water vapor with every breath, and you perspire even when you don't know it. And this turns out to be a significant source of moisture. There's some other occupancy-related moisture sources here. We could dry clothes on a rack, take showers, cooking, doing dishes, plants and pets. All these things kind of vary a lot depending on occupant behavior, even drying firewood. But they all happen, and they all release moisture significantly less than just sort of the base rate of occupants. And if you add them all together, you might see something like worst case scenario of 30 pints of moisture generation in a day for this typical house. On the right side, I show natural moisture sources. These don't depend on occupancy, but they depend on the building itself. It's the way that it was built, its location, and the weather. And we have to do some calculations to sort of estimate how much moisture might be coming from these natural sources. So take, for example, if we had no slab in this building, probably not reasonable for a 1970s house, but maybe a house built around 1900. If we had a dirt floor, we could see sort of high rates of moisture, calculated at about 60 pints a day for a 100 square foot area. Of course, a house this size might have a several hundred square foot basement, so that could easily be hundreds of pints per day. Similarly, if the foundation was damaged or, as just happens over time, there was leaks through some of the mortar joints, you might have occasional standing water. For every 100 square foot puddle, you might add up to 45 pints a day. Again, for big sort of liquid water events, this could be hundreds of pints. Even wet concrete from recent rains or a high water table can also accelerate the addition of moisture through the slab. And this could be, again, 30 plus pints per day per 100 square feet. And then lastly, we have infiltration. This is the rate at which the building is exchanging air with the outside. In the summertime, we often have humid weather. For a building of this air leakage rate, we might expect during a pretty humid event that we could introduce up to 30 pints a day during moisture. So the key takeaway here is that during summertime, all these things could add together and give us some excess moisture in our home, and we have to find a way to remove this moisture. If you add it together, this could be hundreds or even thousands of pints of moisture per day. It's important to know that dehumidifiers are not sized to meet loads of hundreds to thousands of pints. So the first thing we could kind of conclude is that Dehumidifiers are not for dealing with liquid water, whether that's coming up through the ground or leaky foundation. They might be able to deal with it temporarily, but the size of typical consumer equipment is more in line with the occupancy-based loads and the infiltration-based loads. So this is where the moisture comes from. We have a few different options in how we handle it. There are really only 5 options here to deal with moisture. I guess 6 options if doing nothing counts, which we do see and can work. In the upper left, I show a fan. This is a fan that might go in a window. It's really the same as open windows. It's the same as any ventilation system exchanging outside air, and it's even the same as infiltration. It only really works to remove humidity when the outdoor absolute moisture level is less than the indoor level. That doesn't happen very frequently in the summertime. So for someone to do this, they'd have to be very careful about when they had the fan on or windows open versus when they were closed. So it's not really a viable strategy of controlling moisture levels. It might be an occasional strategy for drying out a home. In the bottom left, I have a central air conditioner. This is a typical split system that you might see paired to the furnace. It's very common in Minnesota, especially single-family homes. These systems work really well to actively remove moisture, and they do it very effectively. The problem is they don't control humidity levels, and dehumidification is a byproduct of cooling. In most cases, the systems aren't really sized appropriately to deliver good dehumidification and adequate cooling, particularly true for basements. So it's important to recognize that these systems can remove moisture, but they can't control humidity levels. A couple specific dehumidifier products I want to go over really quickly before we never speak of them again. On the upper right, I show what's called a thermoelectric dehumidifier, sometimes called an electric dehumidifier. These systems you can identify from their very small size, lightweight, maybe the size of a toaster, and very, very low price, somewhere around 20 to 50 bucks. They use what's called the Peltier effect to condense moisture, albeit very inefficiently, something around 4 to 5% efficiency. And they distinguish themselves in that they can only remove ounces of moisture per day. So we've been talking in pints. These things have capacity of ounces. They're usually marketed for cabinet or closet dehumidification. Sometimes, particularly on the internet, you'll find them marketed for dehumidifying occupied spaces. They cannot do this. They're functionally useless for dehumidifying occupied spaces, and they're really only reserved for niche situations. In the bottom right, I show something that might look familiar to most of you as a dehumidifier. It's in fact a desiccant dehumidifier. These units use a desiccant, sort of a thermal compression cycle to remove moisture. They're not very common at all up here in the Midwest, and nor are they very efficient. They're often marketed as very quiet, which they are, and they do excel at very cold temperature dehumidifications. So in the 30 to 50 degree range, usually colder than Minnesota basements. One of their applications is crawl spaces, which are not very frequent up here in Minnesota either. So last but not least is the most common way that we dehumidify our homes in Minnesota. This is the vapor compression dehumidifier. We have 3 of them shown here. The newest one on the left is a year old. The middle one is about 40 years old, and the one on the right is about 20 years old. They're all still of the same size. They all basically are the same. Not much has really advanced in dehumidifier technology over the last 40 or 50 years, except really efficiency. And these units are the subject of this cycle. I will point out that larger versions of these systems can be installed in ductwork to provide whole house dehumidification, although whole house dehumidifiers are very rare in Minnesota, and we sort of exclude them from this study. So the focus here is on vapor compression dehumidifiers in Minnesota. So how do these systems work? Well, I mentioned, maybe I didn't, that they are mechanically the same as refrigerators or air conditioners. But they have one unique property that sort of sets them apart from all these other vapor compression devices. Refrigerators and ACs, they have 2 heat exchangers, and basically they move heat between them. So the AC moves heat from inside the house to outside the house. A refrigerator moves energy from inside the icebox to the kitchen. Dehumidifiers put these heat exchangers right next to each other, which seems maybe silly, but this is actually how they remove moisture without cooling, which is what makes them useful. So if you look at this diagram, moist air enters a dehumidifier drawn in by a fan. Refrigerant that is inside the internals of the dehumidifier evaporates in a heat exchanger that's called the evaporator. That takes energy, and that energy comes from condensing moisture out of the air. It condenses on the evaporator because the evaporator is cold. The air surrounding that is saturated. Remember, saturated air can't hold water, and so it has no choice but to condense out. Water then drips off that heat exchanger into a collection bucket. Right after that, this airstream passes through that second heat exchanger. And this is where the refrigerant is being cooled after it's condensed by the compressor. So that refrigerant is hot and it needs to cool down so that it can later evaporate in the evaporator. And as the airstream passes through this heat exchanger, it's warmed up. Thus, moist air enters the dehumidifier and warm, dry air exits the dehumidifier. And an important thing is that air coming out of the dehumidifier is always warmer. So while dehumidifiers don't actually cool the space, they do slightly increase the temperature of spaces they operate in. And it's this co-location of dehumidifiers that lets them control humidity levels. Since they're not going to overcool the space, they can monitor humidity and then turn on and off based on that humidity level. So if we look in a little bit more detail, dehumidifiers can run continuously. If they were doing this in practice, they wouldn't meet the load. So they'd be calling for a constant need of dehumidification. In most cases, though, they cycle. That is, they turn it on and off as they meet the set point. In practice, this is what a dehumidifier cycle looks like. I'm plotting here the power of a particular unit over about a 28 minute period. And I'm going to walk through how a typical cycle will go in a modern dehumidifier. So a modern dehumidifier has a humidistat that consumes almost no power in standby mode, just milliwatts, and all it does is monitor the humidity. When it detects that the humidity is higher than the set point, the unit powers on. It has a compressor and a fan that are single speed. They ramp up to their steady state power relatively quickly. In this case, this is a 30-pint EnergySTAR 4 unit that runs at about 280 watts. During this time, a fan is drawing air through the unit at about 100 to 200 CFM, depends on the fan speed. And it's dehumidifying as long as the compressor and the fan are on. This particular cycle lasts about 20 minutes. At that point, this unit senses lower humidity in the room. It says it no longer needs to dehumidify, so it powers the compressor off. At this point, around 6:20, there's no longer dehumidification occurring, but you see the fan is still running. 90% of dehumidifiers run what's called a fan-only period, or maybe you might call it a purge cycle after the main cycle. Usually runs for about 3 minutes. There's no dehumidification in this time, but it might serve two purposes, and manufacturers are not exactly straightforward about this. One purpose is that it's sort of an easy interlock that prevents the compressor from starting up again too quickly. Extreme short cycling of compressors can damage them. But the main purpose is probably to clear moisture off the evaporator. Again, dehumidifiers aren't very smart. This dehumidifier doesn't know when it's going to be run again. So they want to make sure that the excess moisture isn't sitting on this fan, on this evaporator, and maybe leading to microbial growth or things that could later affect performance. So this fan blows the moisture off the coil, and then the unit enters standby mode again to monitor humidity levels, where it consumes almost negligible amounts of power. Like other appliances, dehumidifiers are subject to federal minimum efficiency standards, and there's the EnergySTAR program that has a higher standard for energy efficient rated units. EnergySTAR has been rating dehumidifiers since about 2001. Since that time, it's undergone 6 or 7 revisions. This year, or actually last year, we officially started EnergySTAR 5.0. And that rates dehumidifiers basically on 2 parameters, their capacity and their efficiency. So the capacity is given in pints per day, the unit that we've been talking about so far, and the efficiency is given in liters of water removed per energy kilowatt hour used. Why they mix SI and imperial unit systems is anyone's guess, but this is how they do it, and this is how they'll continue to do it. Currently, EnergySTAR 5 has sort of 3 capacity bins, sort of small, medium, and large units. And then the efficiency, the minimum efficiency of each of these capacity units increases as the units get larger and larger. Up until last year, dehumidifiers, this last standard, dehumidifier capacity and efficiency were rated at an operating point of 80 Fahrenheit and 60% relative humidity. Department of Energy sort of recognized that this actually wasn't a very representative use case, so they recently changed this with a new standard to a operating condition of 65 Fahrenheit and 60% RH, which is a lot more in line with their Minnesota applications. This has some important implications, which we'll get into later. But it's important to know that because of this change, the previous generation units are no longer comparable to current generation units in terms of capacity or efficiency. You kind of have to go through some calculations to compare them across generations. Also note, and I'll get into this a little bit later, that we're still sort of on the growing pains in terms of the standards transition. So there's still a lot of confusion in the retail marketplace about what standards are out there and what consumers should be following. So this is sort of the background on humidity and dehumidification. Hope it's enough to let us all kind of have the same basis for discussing the work we did in this study. So the first thing I want to talk about is our broad survey of single-family occupants and their dehumidifiers. We wanted to learn who uses them, why they use them, how they use them. We wanted to characterize units that are out there as well as the spaces in which they operate. We want to use these data to develop representative use cases for further study so that when we collect data in the field, our results are broadly applicable across the state. So we did a statewide penetration survey, followed by a dehumidification survey, and then we had trained staff visit sites, all to sort of collect data on Minnesota single-family dehumidification applications. On the right, you can see a figure here of approximate locations where we performed surveys and got site visits. You can see we are roughly proportional to the statewide population, so we think our results are very applicable in terms of the survey data we collected and the site visit data we collected. And sort of here are some of the headline figures. We determined that about 56% of single-family homes in Minnesota have a dehumidifier. The lowest was 43% up in the Northeast. The highest was 59% down in the Southwest. We found that renters are 25% less likely to have a unit than homeowners. 95% of dehumidifiers operate in basements. So these are almost exclusively for basement dehumidification. Most of these basements are fully below grade, and we found that 70% of dehumidifiers operate in utility space, where utility space is either the room with mechanicals or a completely unfinished basement. And rather staggering response for us is that 91% of respondents said that their dehumidifiers meet their needs. This is a surprising level of satisfaction that we don't regularly encounter. However, only one of our surveys or site visits cited energy efficiency. So there seems to be a relatively large disconnect with the services provided by dehumidifiers and the energy use in typical households. So here are the makes represented throughout the state. You can see some familiar brands: Frigidaire, General Electric, Kenmore, Whirlpool, some others. There's no clear majority. The results here probably reflect variations that we've seen in the retail space as that's changed over the last 20 years or so. In terms of energy efficiency, here we see the units that are EnergySTAR rated versus the minimum efficiency units. The most striking response here is that most survey respondents didn't know whether their units was EnergySTAR rated or not. One reason for this is that the EnergySTAR rated EnergySTAR branding is very inconsistent and exceptionally poor on dehumidifiers. Many of them don't have a label. Many of them don't even have a label in the manual. You'd have to dig through the EnergySTAR website to actually find out if it was rated. Not surprisingly, most folks don't do this. However, those who did know, and our site visits show that EnergySTAR rated units occur about a 2-to-1 ratio to minimum efficiency units. Here we see the distribution of age of the units. See that over 1/3 of them are out in the field are less than 3 years old, and the unit age, the frequency sort of falls off with age. However, we'll note that about 1/4 of units are technically beyond end of life, which is 10 years according to the Department of Energy. Here we show the capacities of the units out there. You can see that the most frequent are smaller units, less than 32 pints, and they're about equally represented in groups beyond that. I will note here that the capacities have changed a lot over the years, and almost all those changes reflect changes to the EnergySTAR standard, which has also sort of changed both the efficiency and capacity bins that they've determined. And we see that the manufacturers basically just fall in line after the EnergySTAR program makes changes. We also asked folks a lot of questions about why they dehumidify. In this case, what is the purpose of their dehumidification? And then we bin their responses. Found that overall, through these questions, respondents had a fairly strong intuition about humidity and its effects in the built environment, and then their responses to it with dehumidifiers. In this case, we see that they respond in general. They express maybe vague moisture concerns, a desire to maintain comfort, the want to avoid microbial growth, eliminate odors, and protect equipment. We asked participants why they dehumidify, or when they dehumidify, excuse me. People dehumidify in July and August. Not surprisingly, they're the 2 wettest months of the year in Minnesota. See that To a slightly less extent, they dehumidify in June and September, then followed by what we might call the transition or shoulder seasons for dehumidification, which include April, May, and October. And of course, some folks operate dehumidifiers year-round. We asked about unit drainage. Units can drain, portable dehumidifier units can drain one of two ways. Automatically, which is via hose to a floor or a sink drain. About 40% of the units in Minnesota drain this way. The majority, however, about 60%, collect condensate in a bucket, and then the user has to periodically empty that bucket. Shown here is sort of the self-reported frequency of how often that manual empty event occurs. We see here that half of the respondents say that they empty their buckets daily. A quarter say that they empty it every few days, and slightly fewer empty it weekly or less. This is important because full dehumidifier buckets are disabled by a float valve to prevent them from overflowing and spilling on the ground. But while the bucket's full, they can't remove moisture or control humidity, which may have important effects on the dehumidified space. We collected a lot more data about dehumidifiers, basement characteristics, operational characteristics. You can find all that in our final report. We used that then to try to understand all the most 20 representative use cases for our ensuing fieldwork. That's what I want to talk about next. So our goal of our survey was to collect the data so that we could identify 20 representative sites for this next phase of the project. We looked at all the dehumidifier characteristics in terms of make, age, capacity, efficiency, basement characteristics, level of finish and conditioning in those basements, building characteristics, including size, grade, gutters, things that might lead to dehumidification loads. And we chose 20 sites that we thought sort of represented all the applications, best represented the applications in Minnesota. And we instrumented those dehumidifiers in those spaces to remotely monitor performance, efficacy, and costs for a full season. We then intervened where necessary to improve dehumidification outcomes, and then monitored those sites for another full season. In terms of instrumentation, each dehumidifier was outfitted with instruments to measure continuous power consumption, temperature, and relative humidity at the outlet, condensate production continuously throughout the season. We also put sensors in to measure ambient conditions, to measure temperature and relative humidity in the ambient space that was being dehumidified at the main thermostat, and then in other locations where necessary. For homes that had central air conditioners, we monitored AC runtime. We also monitored some runtime of some portable window air conditioners. Talk a little bit about a unique aspect of our study, which is the measurement of the condensate produced by these dehumidifiers. As far as I know, the prior fieldwork didn't look at this for a good reason. It turns out it's quite difficult to measure, and this was a very large difficulty getting this going early on in our study. We ended up employing 3 techniques to measure condensate at different sites, depending on site-specific configurations. The first, sort of the easiest one, but did require sort of user participation, was just to measure it on a scale. Every time somebody with a manually emptied dehumidifier emptied it, we asked them to weigh their bucket and write it down, and they periodically transmitted those measurements to us. In a slightly more automated way, we asked them to dump that bucket through our own bucket, under which we placed a rain gauge that would automatically measure that condensate and then forward us that result digitally. Both those provided sort of discrete measurements of condensate that happen according to when the users empty those buckets. So they gave us good data about when the condensate was collected, but they did so sort of at the consequence of not giving us detailed data of how that condensate was produced over the changes in operating conditions between that moment and the last empty. But when units were auto-drained, we got to employ the third method, which is just a rain gauge placed right under the outlet of the unit, so basically intercepting the hose. This allowed us to get continuous condensate measurements and then better connect the energy use and operating conditions with the condensate production. So I mentioned we also intervened at most of these sites to try to improve dehumidification outcomes. We employed both equipment interventions and operational interventions. We essentially replaced all units that were not at least EnergySTAR 4 rated with new units. That included 13 30-pint EnergySTAR 4 dehumidifiers from 3 different manufacturers. We installed 4 50 to 90-pint high-efficiency dehumidifiers. We call them high efficiency because they exceeded EnergySTAR standards. Then we changed the operational environments of these dehumidifiers, with our goal being to try to maintain 50% relative humidity across basement spaces. It's important to know that this is sort of a flexible goal. We had to work with homeowners. In some cases, they wanted to maintain some of their ideas about humidity, so it was more of a compromise. But the goal overall was to maintain 50% relative humidity across basement spaces as a starting point, and moving on from there in coordination with homeowners. So sometimes we increased set points, decreased set points, we changed fan speeds. We did do 11 conversions from manual to automatic drain. So at the end of the study, 19 of 20 units were automatically draining. And then we moved 6 units around the spaces to try to change the dehumidifier outcome. So what did we measure? Well, most important thing is we measured the energy use. Here's sort of the headline energy numbers. These are box plots of annual energy use pre and post intervention for all 20 sites. We can see the blue, as found units consumed a very wide range in energy, all the way from 70 kilowatt hours a year to almost 2,000, the average being 824 kilowatt hours a year. Post intervention, we see that the energy use across these sites tightened quite a bit, sort of reflecting our interventions. And the average fleet decreased to 644 kilowatt hours per year. Typical daily energy figures were about 4 to 7 kilowatt hours a day for June to September. Then they fall off in the shoulder season of dehumidification, April, May, October, to less than 2 kilowatt hours a day. And the average loads throughout the rest of the year were essentially non-existent. We do see that dehumidifiers occasionally operate to discrete events throughout the rest of the year, but these are not really material for considering broader dehumidification applications. The other thing we measured was condensate production. So how much moisture are the units actually removing? Here's another box plot, in this case of daily condensate production. This is just under 7,000 days in this study. So 20 sites times 150 days per season. That's my audience back there. Hopefully he's not too loud, the barking. So we did this for all 20 sites, and we can see that if we just look at the raw numbers, July and August, the wettest months of the year, we're moving about 7 to 8 pints per day on average, which is in line with the energy figures. If we look at April, May, and October, we see that it falls off sharply due to only a few pints per day. And then the rest of the year, again, they may be running occasionally, but they're not really removing moisture on most days. Overall, we find that moisture removal rates are not correlated with unit size. So we had units in the study from 25 to 75 pints, and the moisture removal rates were not correlated at all with their size. We found they were highly correlated with outdoor humidity, which is not really surprising. But overall, we found that moisture loads on about 80% of the homes are very low. And over 99% of days in this study, that's less than 60 out of almost 7,000, are less than 31 pints per day, or about the smallest rated unit size of unit on the market. So we have these energy numbers, we have these condensate numbers. This enables us to calculate energy efficiency, or the energy factor. We call this the field energy factor because, unlike the ratings, we calculate over the range of conditions at each site. And the field energy factors we calculate for the study are shown here on the left. We've broken out as found, so all the units that we initially found. And then we looked at individually the EnergySTAR 4 and the high efficiency groups of units. So as found units in the field at a median efficiency of 0.5 liters per kilowatt hour. EnergySTAR 4 units significantly better at 0.85 liters per kilowatt hour. And high efficiency units remove around 1.35 liters per kilowatt hour. All these values, however, are significantly less than anticipated from the rated performance, as shown on the right, where we've divided our measurements by the rated efficiency levels. You can see that both as found and EnergySTAR 4 units are performing about at 30% of the rated conditions. The high efficiency units are slightly better, but they're still only performing about 55% of their rated performance value. So this appears to be very not good, a massive underperformance compared to the rated conditions. So why is this happening? Well, after a lot of detailed study, turns out the reasons are pretty simple. It has to do with the operating conditions. So up until 2019, units were rated at an operating condition of 80 Fahrenheit and 60% relative humidity. This last year, we have a better condition for basement applications. That's about 65% Fahrenheit and 60% relative humidity. However, average basement conditions in the study were 68 Fahrenheit and 48% relative humidity. That's 48% drier than the 2012 standard, and it's still 12% drier than the 2019 standard. I want to remind you that dehumidifiers are simple machines that haven't changed much over the past decades. They run at constant speed and relatively constant operating points. So when drier air enters these units, they remove less moisture. It's really that simple. Let's maybe look into that in a little bit more detail. Back in 2011, NREL lab tested dehumidifiers with a fantastic lab setup to see if those units could achieve their efficiency ratings. Short answer is they found that they all achieved their efficiency ratings, but they also tested a bunch of other temperature and relative humidity conditions and came up with this sort of generalized chart of normalized performance. So if we look at the intersection of the orange lines, that's at 80 Fahrenheit and 60% relative humidity. They found that, in fact, they have a normalized energy factor of 1. They were meeting their performance expectations. But you can see that as it gets drier, normalized energy factor falls. As it gets cooler, normalized energy factor falls. Remember, drier air enters these units and they remove less moisture. So the DOE decided to upgrade this testing condition this last year, and that's the new testing condition is given by the intersection of the blue lines, 65 Fahrenheit and 60% relative humidity. So you can see just by this change in this operating condition on the testing standard, we would expect normalized energy factors about 0.7. That's 30% less efficiency just from the standards change. It's pretty staggering. On the other hand, our basement conditions in the study are represented by the green square. You can still see that most of the area here is at a normalized energy factor that's less than even the new standard. So the new standard still doesn't reflect how dry it is in our cool basements that we keep drier than 60% relative humidity. And in fact, this explains almost all of the discrepancy between what we measured and the rated efficiency. 70–90% of this performance loss is just the difference in operating point. So this seems really simple, but unfortunately none of this is communicated in the project literature or the retail space, and there's a lot of consequences for that. Basically, nobody has any idea in a cold basement how much energy or condensate should be removed, especially if they're taking guidance from these rated conditions. But there's some other reasons that dehumidifiers don't perform as well as they should. The main one is short cycling. So like other HVAC systems, short cycling can impair performance. Recall the cycle I showed earlier. There's always some fan energy at the end of a cycle. So for shorter cycles, there's proportionally higher fan energy. This is an inefficiency. Secondly, as the dehumidifier warms up to get to steady state, goes through the warm-up process, it has to reach its operating points. This is another inefficiency that sort of scales with the inverse of cycle length. However, the most pernicious inefficiency for short cycles in dehumidifiers is, again, tied to this fan energy at the end of the cycle. This fan is blowing moisture off the evaporator, and it's blowing it right back into the space. Energy was already used to condense that moisture, so all that energy is wasted. In the shortest cycle, we measured that this can reduce efficiency by a staggering 35%. Other issues can lead to minor inefficiencies that we see in other HVAC systems. So the fouling of filters and heat exchangers can reduce airflow and diminish heat transfer. Units can lose refrigerant over time. Their components can fail. These are usually temporary losses in performance that will happen immediately before catastrophic failure of the unit. But keep in mind, all these effects are additive on top of those operating conditions. So it all kind of adds together, and it's really no surprise that some of our older units, we found them operating less than 10% of their rated efficiency. In other words, they're using 10 times the amount of energy they should to remove some moisture from the air. So we measured how well these units work, observed some of the ways they lose performance. But what does this all mean at the end? Well, occupants, people in general, generally care about one thing, and that's the cost. So what's the cost effectiveness of providing portable dehumidification services in Minnesota? Well, based on the energy use, we found that the costs varied according to energy use. Average costs are about $115 a year to provide, portable dehumidification in Minnesota. EnergySTAR 4 units can meet this load at less energy, so they cost about $62 a year. High efficiency units use even less energy. They might cost about $46 a year on average. When you add in the cost of a new EnergySTAR 4 unit, the payback is just under 4 years. So even under a limited 5-year life, EnergySTAR 4 units are cost effective compared to the Minnesota existing fleet of units. Unfortunately, the high efficiency units take a very long time to pay off because they're quite expensive. They're about 3 or 4 times the amount of a consumer unit. And so these units really need 15 or 20 year lifetimes to pay off their high initial cost. We also want to talk a little bit about the capital costs of consumer-rated dehumidifiers. Up until the standards change for minimum efficiency and EnergySTAR and the rating condition, manufacturers were claiming that it was going to cost a lot more. $50 to $70 would be added to the cost of a dehumidifier in order for them to meet the new standards. And so we wanted to see if that actually happened. We bought a bunch of EnergySTAR 4 units at the beginning of the study. And at the end of the study, EnergySTAR 5 had come into place, and we have now a marketplace where there's a lot of units. So we checked all their prices last summer, and we found some pretty surprising results. Basically, there's no cost premium to EnergySTAR 4 or EnergySTAR 5 units over minimum efficiency units. In fact, they're usually cheaper. This is in part because we actually had a hard time finding minimum efficiency units. There's only a few available. But at the end of the day, we paid about $210 2 years ago for EnergySTAR 4 dehumidifiers, and now we're looking at $150 to $200 for the same EnergySTAR 4 or EnergySTAR 5 rated dehumidifiers. In many ways, I'm like the folks in the study. I ran a dehumidifier that came with my house. I'm pretty sure a realtor put it in my basement to try to sell the house. That was 12 years ago. It always worked. I never paid any attention to it. Following my own advice, this last summer I replaced my 12-year-old dehumidifier with an EnergySTAR 5 unit I bought on sale for $119. It's quiet, meets the load, and it uses about 100 less watts when operating. Some additional observations on our on the study and the fieldwork. There's more of these in the final report, but I just want to reiterate that dehumidifiers use a fair amount of energy. They're substantial plug loads. Our average results show that they're probably in excess of 10% of the annual energy consumption of average Minnesota home, both pre and post intervention. There were some questions coming in the study about the reliability of the digital controls on dehumidifiers. They're notorious for using basically $2 sensors, but we found that those cheap sensors were reliable, at least within the uncertainty bounds that they themselves have and our lab instruments have. And there was no cases of sensor failure or unreliable sensors. We did find also that humidity control can be maintained throughout multi-room convoluted basements as long as there's good airflow passages. We found that the 100 to 200 CFM from these units effectively mixes basement air. Sometimes it's enough to even mix air from other levels in the home. We found that automatic draining units maintain better humidity control than manually drained units. They simply don't stop for full buckets. In fact, owners came to appreciate this intervention more than all others. In fact, they liked it even more than the free dehumidifiers. It was sort of a significant quality of life improvement for them to not to have to worry about emptying a bucket, and then they never quit working. We also found that ACs, neither central nor window units, provide consistent basement dehumidification or control basement humidity levels. But dehumidifiers underperform ratings. They use 820 kilowatt hours a year on average in Minnesota. This is about 3 times more energy than you'd anticipate from the old performance ratings, still about twice the amount of energy from the new ratings. Again, most of this is due to the operating conditions. They operate less efficiently in cool and dry basement conditions just simply because there's less moisture in the air. The remaining 10 to 30% of that increased energy is due to mainly short cycling and might be attributable to unit deterioration. Again, efficiency ratings don't consider basement conditions. The old one was especially bad. The new one is arguably less bad, but there's still, we have drier air in our basements than either of them acknowledge. Short cycles greatly reduce performance. Fan operation at the end of the cycle re-evaporates water off the coil. That's the main effect, but also units take a long time to warm up to reach steady state. We found that there's still a lot of very old units out there that predate all energy efficient standards, and still a lot of somewhat recent units that are subject to early efficiency standards that have changed a lot over the last 20 years. That said, we confirmed what the surveys reported, which is that dehumidifiers are effective. Dehumidification season in Minnesota is long, April through October. Surveys and our measurements and outside conditions, though, all sort of suggest that 90% of moisture is removed between June and September. Those are the key months. These typical loads are much smaller than commonly assumed, especially for many ratings-based calculations. Our average peak loads are in the range of 5 to 8 pints per day during June and September, excepting the few sort of high load homes. And units are usually oversized because of this, so that enables them to overcome any kind of performance limitations and generally maintain adequate humidity levels on a wide variety of operating conditions. So some takeaways from this project. We strongly encourage dehumidifier replacement programs or incentives that remove older units, especially pre-EnergySTAR units, from service. And these incentives should not be tied to new units. As we've shown, there's not really a cost premium to efficient units. They should be tied to actually recycling old units. I got a unit that was a hand-me-down. It was a fairly common response that folks in the survey had units from hand-me-down units, but if somebody buys a new energy efficient unit and hands it off to their cousin, that's not an energy savings, that's just shifting energy around. So we strongly encourage recycling old units and any incentive programs tied to that. We also prefer small units, 30 pint per day or less capacity units can meet the vast majority of loads that we encounter in Minnesota basements. Here we kind of remember that dehumidifiers are not great for removing moisture for large, consistent liquid water intrusions. So we point to other solutions if those are the situations someone's encountering. Again, buy an EnergySTAR 5 unit. There's no cost savings by purchasing a minimum efficiency unit. Those units have nothing compelling to offer. They have fewer features. They're not any more reliable. They just somehow exist in the marketplace. We encourage units to be set up for automatic drains. Not only does it provide better humidity control, but a lot of folks didn't really know this was an option, and they thought that it was a significant quality of life improvement. We encourage measuring relative humidity levels with remote hygrometers. Sort of rare that people measure relative humidity in their homes. Kind of the only point they often have is on the dehumidifier itself. But we found that it helps sort of to connect humidity levels in a basement with a reading that they can view more frequently, say up by their thermostat, to sort of connect their intuition of humidity with a measured value. And then again, lastly, we initially encountered set points all over the place, but we strongly recommend sticking to something that's 50 to 55% as a starting point, and then it can be changed based on specific needs after that point. So that's basically it, but I want to kind of conclude here with one sort of reminder about what's happening right now. So we're currently still in this transition phase of energy standards as we move from EnergySTAR 4 to EnergySTAR 5. EnergySTAR 5 technically is about a year old now, but this past summer when we looked at what's available in the retail space, we found there's a lot of confusion. There's still a lot of EnergySTAR 4 units available. There is no distinguishing. You have to really understand what you're looking at to distinguish between EnergySTAR 4 and EnergySTAR 5 rated units. The most common strategy for manufacturers to get EnergySTAR 5 rated units is just to derate EnergySTAR 4 rated units. You recall that the change in operating condition was about 30%. So basically, an EnergySTAR 5 is exactly the same as an EnergySTAR 4. It just has 30% less efficiency and 30% less capacity. Basically, right now, there's no place that you can get definitive information about EnergySTAR rated appliances except for the EnergySTAR rated website. So I recommend that that is the only place you look for information about what is and what is not a currently high efficiency dehumidifier. But I expect this to clear up in the future. And with that, I guess we'll open it to questions.
Great. Thank you, Josh. That was really a great presentation. If you have not already done so, please type any additional questions you have in the Q&A panel and send them to us. Laura, you probably have, we ran over a little bit, so we probably have only about 5 minutes or so for Q&A. But do you have any questions for Josh?
Yeah, we got a couple questions. All right, first question. Are energy recovery ventilators considered a whole house dehumidifier?
Energy recovery ventilators, or ERVs, are not whole house dehumidifiers. They can help moderate humidity changes, but they cannot provide the services of dehumidifiers.
All right. With dehumidifiers being a big plug load, do utilities think about, quote, energy saver programs for them to turn them off during summer peak hours?
We have not considered this. Well, in this study, I say we have considered it. And it's something that we plan on looking into in the future. Now that we've collected all this data about when they operate, when they're trying to meet the loads, we do think that there is an opportunity for either using some of the new smart features on these units or some scheduling processes to basically allow them to provide demand response type capabilities.
Great. That's an interesting question. Did you encounter anyone setting too low or pulling in excess moisture?
Yes, we actually encountered a lot of units. In fact, some are maybe configured from the factory to start out at 35% relative humidity set points. Most of those units actually can't meet that set point, so they will run continuously until they are manually shut off. And we did encounter substantial energy savings from encouraging those folks, not always successfully, to sort of moderate their set points to 50 or 55%.
Great. And let's just squeeze in this one last question. Even though they were not part of the study, based on your expertise, how do you feel a whole home dehumidifier would stack up in terms of efficiency and moisture removal?
In terms of efficiency and moisture removal, I think a whole home dehumidifier is probably the best approach. It would give you supreme control at the lowest possible energy use. However, they're very costly and you just can't make the cost argument. That said, I'm very impressed with the high efficiency units that we use, and I would consider one for my own home.
All right. Well, we were able to get through all the questions. So I'll turn it over to Mary Sue to close.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Josh. If you have any follow-up questions about this project, feel free to contact Josh or one of us, and we'll get back to you. The recording of this webinar and the slide set will be available on the department's website in a few weeks, and the final report in a couple of months. When available, you can link to either of these from our quick links on our Applied Research and Development webpage, as indicated on this slide. This R&D page has additional resources and information related to CARD that you might want to check out. The address is at the bottom of the slide and can be linked directly from there. Thanks for participating today. We appreciate your interest in CARD projects. And before we leave, I want to take this opportunity to mention several upcoming CARD webinars. On November 10th, Slipstream will present a webinar about the energy costs and emissions impacts of measures that both save electricity and shift load from time of day. On December 4th, the Center for Energy and Environment will be back to talk about the results from their investigation of evolving residential cooling systems and loads in Minnesota. A second December webinar will be on December 16th, in which the 2050 partners will discuss results from an 18-month process to develop a roadmap for a Minnesota Codes and Standards program. You can keep abreast of upcoming webinars and other news related to the Minnesota Conservation Improvement Program by signing up for SIP updates in our mailing list. You can use the link on this slide to do that. And in the meantime, please feel free to contact me if you have questions, feedback, or suggestions for the CARD program or CARD webinars. Thanks again for participating today in our webinar. We look forward to having you join us in the future.